Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Annie Legnini. I am the program director and artist in residence with Sicily Artist Retreats. I just want to thank you for joining us tonight and taking the time to be present and listen to this amazing discussion that I'm really excited for with Brian Booth Craig and Carlo Massimo. So I'm going to hand this off to Carlo in just a second, but just to say who we are and give a little introduction to our esteemed panelists. This conversation is part of our programming with Sicily Artist Retreats. Sicily Artist Retreats is an international art school based in Marsala, Sicily, and we offer drawing, painting, and sculpture programming that with a focus on contemporary sculpture um, throughout the spring and fall seasons. But there's more programming coming. Stay tuned for that. And we are so lucky to have Brian Boot Craig with us in October of this year. So if you join this webinar, I'm sure you know a bit about Brian's work, but in case you don't, Brian is internationally acclaimed leading figure in contemporary sculpture, specializing in bronze. His work is really fantastic. I'm always blown away by it. So Brian sculpts from life, turning classically inspired figures and techniques into contemporary manifestations and icons. Really phenomenal stuff. He's exhibited extensively both in the States and abroad and has been teaching in Italy for the last 8 years. Am I right, Brian? Like 8 years?
13, no, 14 years now.
14, excuse me, 14 years. So incredible. You are in the best of hands. It's my little pitch for the workshop, but we'll talk more about that later. Um, so we are so lucky and excited to have him here in Sicily with us, to be working with him this fall. So very excited for that. And Brian and Carlo will be having a discussion tonight. Carlo is a journalist, a poet, and a translator of poetry. If you've ever read any of Carlo's work just sparkles. I always say that about Carlo's writing. Carlo's just wonderful to work with, great team member here at Sicily Artist Retreats. And I'm just really excited to hear the discussion between the two of you. So I said before we started recording that I will be moderating and kind of taking charge of the chat. So if you have a question for Brian and Carlo as they're talking, as something comes up, just drop it in the chat and I will kind of like interrupt when necessary and say, "Ooh, excuse me, something in the chat." So feel free, please engage, ask questions, and it's going to be a really nice discussion. So Carlo, can I pass it over to you?
Grand. Thank you, Annie. Buonasera a tutti. Welcome,
Um,
everyone, and welcome above all, Brian. We're so happy to have you here.
Thank
Uh,
you. Thanks.
I just want to start out with a question that maybe some of the members of our audience have asked if they've seen your Instagram page. Your Instagram stories are often poems. They're often screenshots of poems that you've been reading. Um, I'm curious about how much poetry you read and how important poetry is to you as a sculptor and as a person.
Yeah, I probably read every day poetry. Uh, um, and even if I only read one, that's usually enough for me. I'll read one and I'll think about it all day, which is why I post on Instagram that way. It's usually like what I post is literally what I read with having my morning coffee or like, my afternoon coffee. um, um, yeah, so it's always something that I actually am reading and from a book that is off of my bookshelves. So yeah, I think poetry, it's hard to articulate the depth of what it means because um, for me as a sculptor, because it doesn't seem like sculpture and poetry would be like interconnected in a way, in an obvious way. But I for me, it's an indication or a reminder that everything about life is poetry, right? If you make it so. Like
What do you mean?
living a poetic life is the ultimate goal in a way for me. And so it's a reminder to to see things from a sideways glance and not always literally and directly in front of you, to take a different angle on the way you look at something. And so it's a and I part of the reason I post it also is because I think it's unfortunately an art form that not enough people engage with. Although I think that's changing a little bit with social media because it becomes almost like a meme. Although that might be poetry light sometimes.
Mhm.
Still, I think it's maybe seeping into the consciousness of people a little bit. But I put it on my Instagram page usually every day
Mhm.
because I almost want to plant the seed, that like
Sure.
this is an important way to look at the human experience.
Mhm.
Um, and rather than looking at it from a sort of literal dissected point of view where everything is categorized according to its importance to you in the moment, whether it's politics or
Reduce its
or
facts.
yeah, it's exactly
Yeah.
you don't or science or and not that those things aren't also good, but poetry gives you a way to look at all of those things from another point of view, whatever it happens
Mhm.
to be that you're doing. So that's and as a sculptor, one of the things that well, I think this is true for any art, any visual art form, any art form really, but especially in the visual arts. One of the things that I think is important to keep in mind is that you're when you're making something, it's very easy to fall into the
Mhm.
trap of literalism. And this is especially true for people who do
Into sculpture.
representational work. Representational, yeah, exactly, right. Especially representational sculpture, because if it's a figure, you already have a kind of an obvious uh, um, uh, touch point for everybody. Like everybody knows a figure when they see a figure. Okay, um, and it can become a kind of there's a literalness to it because it is what it is. In fact, this was like one of the this has always been a kind of uh, critique of sculpture as an art form going back to the Renaissance. Like there was this debate between painters and sculptors about which one was the higher art form, and sculpture was always considered the lower art form. And the reason is because there's the object is the thing, right? There's no separation between the thing that's depicted and the way it's depicted, right? So painting has, because it's illusory, it was considered a higher art form because of its illusory quality, right? And and painters of course said, well, sculpture is literal. It's the thing it depicts is the thing.
Right.
And of course that's not really true.
Mhm. That
um,
that painting is sort of closer to its Platonic form. That painting kind of
exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's there is a kind the materiality. In other words, a stone is a stone, right? It's not a metaphor for something else, right?
Mhm.
Or right. So anyway, but here's the thing that I think that sculptors would say, and what's missing in that debate is that there is an illusory quality to a representation of a human form in a solid material or immobile, immutable material, at least in human scale time. Uh, and that is that the illusory thing is the illusion of personality, right? The illusion of spirit.
Mhm.
And this is why in all ancient times, there were, sculptures were seen as vessels, almost in an animistic way, vessels for something, some other spiritual element. And that's why, monotheistic religions always smashed them because they thought
Mhm.
this is like a pagan god, right? And in fact, a lot of the Greek sculptures that people take for granted as this formalist art form were really seen like containers for some literal spirit, right?
Mhm.
Like a form of animism, and it's not really, but like you get the point.
Mhm.
Um, and anyway, so the
I think it's also interesting how little sculpture there, how long it took for sculpture to depict human bodies, um, sort of realistically. I mean, there's a
right,
period in the Hellenistic period where they did, but
right,
for so long, sculpture has been the domain of these kind of perfect human specimens, whereas painting
right,
has
right.
way.
That's a good, yeah, that's a really, we can actually, let's bookmark that thought because I think it's like, but it does tie into what I was just saying about the literalness of the trap of literalness when you're working within that tradition of like depicting the body with a level of verisimilitude,
Mhm.
naturalism. I don't like the word realism because that's also an art movement of the 19th century. So I prefer the word the terminology like representational or naturalistic, right? So the thing
Mhm.
is, if you have naturalistic imitative forms, that literalness can become a roadblock to seeing it poetic, and poetry is like another way of looking at it. So anyway, the point of all of that that meandering answer there is that um, I'm always encouraging other like younger representation artists to try to think about the human subject in a poetic way. Try
Mhm.
not to like just think of it as a sort of literal depiction of things. And like in a certain sense, you could say that poetry the um, is the line of inquiry that touches on what is real and what is illusory, and that maybe this experience is the illusory one
Mhm.
and that the real experience is something else. I know that's sort of like more mystical, but that's where I come at it from. So I think I want to it's a good way for me to remind myself to try whatever I'm doing because of the extensive physical labor that I'm involved in to
Mhm.
try to see it from a poetic point of view. And it's really helped me. It actually, I mean, in some ways it got me out of an early trap that I found myself in as a
Oh.
representational sculptor because
Mhm.
I got pretty good really quickly at
Mhm.
representing. Like I have a model in front of me and get it pretty close to the. I mean, I could depict it really quickly.
Mhm.
Um, both drawing and sculpture. But then I was like, I don't know, I didn't know what to do. I didn't have any, there was nothing narrative that I could connect to. I mean, obviously I was very young, so I didn't have the life experience and
Mhm.
the knowledge of the history of sculpture and art behind me to really to infuse it with something. But when you're in a tradition like this that is goes back 2,500 years, and different permutations, but generally there's a through line of thought that gives them some commonality. That that 25-year-old tradition puts you at that stage where you're like, well, what do we do? What do you do next? Right?
Right.
So anyway, so to me, poetry was a way to get myself it relaxes that part of my brain. When I read poetry, it relaxes that part of my brain that wants to see everything is with a one-to-one direct. Okay, there's my phone, there's my dog, there's
Yeah.
my chair, right? It's a way, it's like a daily practice of getting my mind out of that literalness and out of that trap and see things from another angle. And that's, I mean, really good poetry is really hard to write. you
Yes,
know
I know.
I mean, it's well, you're a poet, um,
My
but
my 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 daily defeats, yeah, remind me.
it's
Um,
really difficult. And also, I don't know if you should. The interest here's another thing about it that
mhm.
I haven't really ever talked about. I don't think publicly. That is, I've talked about it with other people, but when I was in university and I was sort of bouncing between majors and settled in studio art, and took a sculpture class, and it just clicked. We had to do a portrait of a classmate, and I still have it. It's the first big representational sculpture I ever did. Prior to that, it was all abstract work, but it was not instructed. They just said pick a partner and you do portraits of each other. And anyway, um, so I started getting interested in representational sculpture. And then went a deep dive into Michelangelo, which is like where everybody starts, right? It's
Right.
kind of, but at
I
the
was hoping you
same
would come up. Mhm.
yeah, yeah. Well, at the same time, around the same time, I mean, obviously my memory is a little fuzzy on exact dates, but around the same time I had a literature class, and in it was a Western literature. I think it was like Renaissance to, I don't know, because Renaissance, continental and English Renaissance literature, right? Anyway, we were late medieval through Renaissance, and we had the professor. One of the assignments was to pick a poem, and like he didn't give us a list. He's like, find a poem from this period and do an analysis of the poem, right? We had to do an analysis of that, um, our selected piece. And unbeknownst to me at the time, Michelangelo wrote a lot of poetry.
Mhm.
Okay. But I don't know how it happened, but at the same time I was started getting interested in sculpting, I discovered no Michelangelo was a poet, and that was the poem I used I dissected for the literature class. And in
Mhm.
fact, when I we had talked about this a little bit before, so people
Mhm.
know that we did discuss this. I found my copy of the book that I bought
Mm.
not long after that assignment. I went and found this book. So I've had this, I won't
I
say
have that
how.
translation. It's
Yeah,
a
do you
box
have this
somewhere.
one?
Yeah,
You
yeah.
have this one? Yeah. I recommend this to everybody. Anyway, so yeah, I won't say when I bought it because that'll date me. People can look, they can Google it. But
It is funny that Michelangelo is a I maybe this is kind of a facile way to say it, but he's a very poetic
one
sculptor. I can't think
one
of
hundred
any
percent,
of
100%
even Bernini is, emotional. He's emotive, but he's not
poetic. Yeah. He's more
poetic.
narrative. He's more narrative. He's
More
more
narrative. Yes, he's more
yeah,
narrative.
he's more narrative. And Michelangelo, that's a really important distinction, because I mean, one way to say, I mean, obviously there's a poetic quality to all great art, right? But I think one way distinction that I like to make is the poetic has more, it indicates more of an internal narrative,
Mhm.
right? And the sort of the histrionic is more of an external narrative, right?
Mhm.
So Bernini is not poetic in the sense of it having some internal narrative, but Michelangelo is. And you
Mhm.
can see also what's really fascinating is that you can see the influence of Michelangelo on Rodin,
Yes.
right? Who also, if you think of his work, it's also like it's the external, like one of the things that makes him, I think, the first modern is that he stripped the external narrative from the sculptural content, right? And so and of course, that's the famous relationship between Rilke and
Right. Mhm.
Rodin, because Rilke and it's because Rilke really saw that poetic quality in Rodin's work. But anyway, the point, going back to the original, like where I started with that, when I discovered that Michelangelo was also a poet, it gave me an insight into his sculpture and his
Mhm.
painting that I think I maybe wouldn't have had without that. And
Yeah.
so that pairing was a kind of natural one from the beginning. And so now I'm always trying to think, when I'm sculpting, what am I am might see my dog right here. He's like,
Yeah.
she's sorry, folks. She's coming into the screen. I'll give her a treat and she'll go. Um,
Good girl.
I was prepared for this. But yeah, now when I'm working, I try to think of it that way. I try to think of like the what is the, even if it's a simple like figure, I'm trying to think what is the poetic internal narrative quality that I'm trying to convey? What is the illusion of spirit or personality under the surface that I want to convey, and also, or maybe through the surface too. But anyway, that's the
I
very,
want
very,
to. So two questions come to
yeah,
mind.
Could
yeah,
I? I'm sorry, Carlo.
Go
yeah.
ahead. Yeah.
No, I don't want to interrupt. I do have a question about emotions from the audience.
Hmm.
Can I jump in, or Carlo,
Of course.
where you
Yeah.
want to
Of course. Of
roll?
course. Of course.
Okay. I do have two questions that popped up from Michael. So one of them was representation of the gods carried with it a whole set of emotions. So can we look at literalism that way, in a broader
Mm.
way? And another question that came in maybe a couple minutes later was same uh, same person. Brian, I've heard painters say that they view their work as evoking emotions. Does that apply as well to sculptors and their work?
Mhm.
Yeah, those are, I mean, so yeah, there's kind of the same question in a way.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I think, yeah, that is a really good question because, we in the contemporary art world, or in contemporary art education, as you both know, can be highly theoretical, right? And like everything gets analyzed and becomes intellectualized, right? Um, but I think ultimately, we remember artistic experiences that move us in some way, right? That have some sort of, or at least have some sort of emotional resonance with another experience that we've had, and can attach to that, right? Whether it's a memory or something's happening in the moment. Um, and uh, I'll give you a good example of this. Okay, this was about 15 years ago. I was in Siena, Italy. My favorite place is in Italy. And I was doing a residency there. So I was there for 6 weeks. And if anybody knows Siena, there's the Duomo di Siena is like my favorite cathedral in Italy. Has a couple Berninis and Michelangelos.
And striking facades that it's
Yeah, the
absolutely
facade
remarkable
is
in
just like,
2017. Yeah.
it's the facade. It's like the story is, you know, the story of like Wagner, the first time he walked into that piazza and saw the facade, he started crying.
Yeah.
So anyway, this is I was living there for 6 weeks. I was going through a lot of stuff in my personal life. Like, don't need to get into that. But and every night I would go there. I work in the studio, and I go there late at night, probably like 11 o'clock at night, and it's beautifully lit at night. And for weeks, there was this young woman, would stand on the steps and play her violin. And I don't know if anybody knows that piazza, but on the opposite side of the piazza, there's a long stone bench on the building there, and people just sit there and look at the cathedral at night. And so every night um, for weeks, I would go there, like probably 2 or 3 weeks. I would go there, and she'd be playing every night, like the violin. And I never talked to her. I never interacted. Just sit there. And one night, the moon was right above the cathedral, full moon. And suddenly, that Giacomo Leopardi poem, "To the Moon." Do you know that poem?
Luna, mia deletta Luna. Yeah.
So that poem like came to my mind. So I'm like, this violin and the Duomo di Siena and the moon and Leopardi comes into my head. And what do you think happened? Like, I just started crying. I just started like bawling. It just like like all these emotions came out of me. So you know, you can sit there in front of that cathedral and you could analyze it as a sculptor. You know, as a sculptor, I would do that, but that's not the same as having an emotional experience with it. And so, to answer that question, um, you know, ultimately, that's, you know, not everything is going to resonate with everybody at every time, right? But ultimately, that's the goal, to have some, to not just make something that's smart. I mean, smart is good, not downplaying that there is an intelligence to the way you approach your art making, and there's a way you can analyze well-made art in an intellectual way. But
How do you, like, for example, how do you locate honestly? And I'm obviously, at a certain point
hmm,
in artists and religion, you know, the mystery defeats the rational brain. But how do you locate that quality in a work of art? If you're seeing a sculpture for the first time, for instance,
yeah,
how do you locate
that's a
it?
really that's a really good question. I do think that, okay, so I think it depends on the art form, because I think that with sculpture, it's a particularly difficult thing
Hmm.
to especially representational sculpture, because it's almost so quotidian in a way that, you know, people can just like walk by it. So I think it's a little difficult with sculpture. But I will say this: I think one of my theories, and one of my theories and principles that I'm pursuing in thought, in making things, and also when I teach, I talk about this a lot when I teach. Um, one of my theories is finding whatever the thing is, whatever the subject is, or the formal composition, and usually both combined, whatever the point of tension is within those things, that's where you go artistically. Like, when, like, you want to find some, and it can be very subtle, it can be simple. Again, it can be formal and compositional. It can be the point of tension in the subject matter. It can be uh, conceptual, right? It can be in the narrative. That, I think, that gives that point of tension, it once your brain subconsciously locates it, it creates some sort of vibration emotionally. I'll give you, like, going back to Michelangelo. This is
Yeah.
one of the things like I often discuss when with students is, Michelangelo was brilliant at this, and it's when I point it out, you're going to start seeing it now. What he would do is his figures, and this is like male figures primarily. We know that they did do some female figures, but primarily male nudes.
Mhm.
But even the ones that aren't nude, this is true.
Mhm.
What you'll notice is he will have a pose. The figure will look like it's almost like languid and relaxing, kind of doing like this. But then you'll see like there will be tensed muscles, not the
Yes.
whole body. There will just be like moments of tension,
Mhm.
right? Where it looks like it's sort of like the risen Christ in Santa Maria Sopra Minerva in Rome. He's doing that. He's kind of reaching across and holding, but he looks like he's got this like really liquid contrapposto, but then when you look at his all the muscles in his torso, they're tense,
Mhm.
right? So there's
Or
in your
the
brain,
Medici tomb. I can't remember which one, but the man who's seeing his art, his hands, he's got these giant Michelangelo hands that are relaxed like that, just
yeah,
kind of hanging in front of him. But
yeah,
you see all his arm and neck are
yeah,
flexed.
it
Mhm.
flexed, yeah. Uh, Carpo did something similar, but anyway, we'll go to like talking about Michelangelo. What he that like I don't it doesn't register immediately with the viewer, but they can feel it. It's like there's a contradictory or tension point of tension in the composition that also points to the subject matter and the concept that he was really interested in, which was, and you get this this is kind of what I was saying about the poetry, right?
Mhm.
You get this a lot in the poetry um is the his sorry, I had a sentence there for him, then I forgot. It's the Neoplatonic.
Mhm.
It's this an internal tension that he felt about his belief systems, which was medieval Catholic, but also Neoplatonic, and of course, there's a kind of his no, Neoplatonism was. The goal was to escape the body, escape. That you would shed the skin of this thing that's weighing you down, right?
Mhm.
That's some oftentimes metaphorical, but you get that in the poetry when you don't understand Michelangelo unless you read this, in my opinion,
Yes.
because he talks about this very very poetically and clearly, uh, that sort of tension between the carnal and the spiritual,
Mhm.
and
But
that
he's never prepared to give up the carnal. His figures are so
yeah.
massive and so
Right,
heavily
exactly.
muscled.
Exactly. That's why it's so great and that's why it's emotive, because you can feel that tension. So that formal tension we're talking about, that liquidity
Mhm.
and the stress of the flexion of the muscles, that's a metaphor for the conceptual thing, which is really the tension between the carnal and the spiritual. And in fact, like one of like Bernini is a fascinating subject to me, because I think his best work was when he got later in life, when he started doing that explicitly, like the Blessed Ludovico Albertoni,
Mhm.
and then the um, uh, 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 the other. I'm sorry, my brain I'm going blank. I'm thinking
Mhm.
of church. I suddenly thinking of churches. Um, the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa. Sorry.
Oh yes. Mhm.
So the same thing, right? That's why they're so memorable, because there's a narrative inside them that you can feel, even if you don't know the story or the
Mhm.
concept behind it. But I really, so we're kind of going first full circle, talking about
Mhm.
the poetic side of Michelangelo, and that's what opened that door to me. I was like, oh wait, this isn't just Moses. This is
Mhm.
totally something. This is something completely different. That's
Mhm.
just a placeholder for a really deeper dive into
Yes.
something more human. So back to the question about emotion. I'm glad that people talk about that, because um, it's a really difficult thing to convey, or to transfer, to have a transference of emotion with the viewer. And we'll get into this talking about my own sculpture, because this is one of the struggles that I'm dealing with, right? This is
Yeah.
like one of my topics of interest or line of inquiries.
Mhm.
But like, so for example, going to Rodin now, one of
Yeah.
the things about Rodin, that where you see this same thing, is that with Rodin you see the tension that he's creating is his hand on the surface. The reason that Rodin was so controversial in his day was because people were like, "Who's this? dirty old man who's like
leaving thumbprints.
kneading the surface of these, it like literally that's what they would talk about that. I mean, there are articles about like they like didn't like whatever the French version of dirty old man was in the 19th century. They literally they thought it was overly carnal, right? But what's happening there is he's creating this literal transfer of his hand on the surface to the viewer. And so another one that I got this from was early on, another early influence for me, around the same time that I was introduced to Michelangelo's poetry, was Louise Bourgeois, because this is going to date me, but when I was in university, she had kind of like she had a long career,
Yeah.
and it was kind of, I mean, people knew her, but it wasn't. She wasn't like in the public consciousness to the way she is now. And so I'll just say it was the early '90s. Okay, so
You're good. Don't
I
worry.
I read an article. I read a New York. I think it was a New York Times article. I read an article about her like having her moment finally, like finally getting the recognition, and she kind of blew up from there, right? I really, that kind of intrigued me, and I started looking at her work, and you do get that kind of tension in her work too. There's the then like everybody knows the spider. That's the most famous, right? The giant spiders, right? Which is like the mother figure, and it's a kind of like an interesting. It's like it's both like an umbrella, like a a shelter, but it's also this giant spider. So it has this like that emotional tension that's built into that makes you really uneasy. You're like not quite sure, is this right? It's like the mother spider, but it's also this giant spider. So anyway, those things always appeal. Those kinds of things appeal to me, and that's where when you're saying where do you locate that emotive quality in sculpture, that's kind of where I landed with it. Whenever I see something that's like, oh man, that really gets me, and then later on when I analyze it, I'm like, okay, why did it work? Because look, I'm a sculptor, so I'm gonna do both. It's kind of like I'm gonna try to enjoy the sculpture, but afterward I'm gonna analyze it.
Yeah, of
Right.
course, of course.
Right. So yeah.
I want to
Anyway.
get into your practice, but I just have one quick
Yeah.
question out of curiosity.
Sure.
There there seems to be a similar divide in sculpture as in poetry, between sort of narrative sculpture
Mhm.
and abstract sculpture or non-narrative sculpture as formal poetry
Yep.
and free verse. Um, and so I'm curious how you see yourself sort of on that spectrum, and I'm curious
Mhm.
about how you see modernist sculpture, like Brancusi Garcia
Yeah.
Bethesda or them, that kind of stripping narrative and leaving emotion. Like, how do you try to do something like that in your work, or how does that?
Yeah. That's also a very good question. Because I think another thing to add to that is a sort of um, there's this spectrum of classicism versus realism, and then the spectrum in between, right? This sort of so I think it layers on top of that
Mhm.
thing that you're just saying about narrative versus non-narrative forms or emotive forms or conceptual forms. And yeah, I think I don't think it's, I mean, look, among representational sculptors, I
Mhm.
don't really hear these discussions very often.
Mhm.
But I have I mean, my range of artist friends and colleagues and things that I look at is pretty broad. So so I think it's a more interesting and maybe instructive thing to look at, say, um, rather than looking at representational sculpture uh, and comparing them, to start by looking at, say, like James Turrell, who is like one of my favorites, or
Mhm.
Anish Kapoor, and then like narrative sculpture, Bernini on the other, right? And so because then you can find where you cross over.
Mhm.
But I do think that this is an interesting. This will get into my practice my own sculpture practice a bit. But
Mhm.
I do think that there is a distinction there, but I think it's a little bit of a red herring,
Mhm.
because the narrative quality of things is always there, right? And the poetic quality is always there when it's done right. So in other words, like when you're experiencing something like an Anish Kapoor or a James Turrell or something, I like James Turrell because it's light. It's not even, the subject is light. It's not, right. So, and it's the form too, right? It's the quote form, and so it's. But the narrative quality is in the material, is in the or the immateriality, and in the viewer's perception of it, right? There is a narrative element there. It's just not an external narrative, right? And in the same way, when you look at something that's like really well done, that's narrative sculpture, say again, a good example would be something like that everybody will know would be Bernini's Pluto and Persephone, right? So it's like narrating. It's a narrative depiction of a moment in a story, right? But there's a poetic quality in it too, right? So I don't think it's a I don't know about the discussions in poetry, but I don't in when it comes to visual art and sculpture, in particular, I personally don't see the clear divide. I think it's just knowing when you're working which of those narrative elements are coming to the fore, whether it's like an external applied narrative or it's an internal narrative or it's a material narrative. Those are the different narrative forms, right? The material, like a material narrative would be like chipping the stone and you leave the tool mark, right? That's a material narrative. The factual quality, right? So the factual quality of a sculpture surface is a form of narrative, right? It's like Rodin's hand on the surface. That is that he didn't need, like, it's a brilliant thought when you realize it. He didn't need an external narrative like Pluto and Persephone. He didn't have to have it. He did it sometimes, but because there was already a narrative in the experience of the sculptor's hand in the clay, right? So there's a story there. There's already my dog's looking for another treat. There's a story there. There's a story there already, but I don't. I would like to see more of that debate among sculptors because I think it's a really useful one to help critique what you're doing, where you are in your own where you are on that spectrum, right?
Has your sense of narrative changed
Yeah,
significantly?
very much so. Like very much so. I when I started like the first real series that I did um was a series of self-portraits.
Mhm.
And
In bronze?
in bronze, yeah, life-size self-portraits, nudes, they're all nudes.
Mhm.
So it was really like it was all male form, but it was really this the reason I wanted to do them as a series of self-portraits is because I wanted to try to make the point. And I don't know, you never know as an artist whether you get your point across, but you try.
Right.
But I was trying to make the point that there's a like the self and the narrative of the self is a myth. You're creating this version of yourself, right? In your whatever it might be, in your head or externally. And so it was really about the internal narrative, right? That you were saying that sort of the non-literal narrative is that kind of sounds strange, sounds contradictory or paradoxical to say that, but it was really about the experience of the self inside of this container, right? What is the self? It's just a thing that we create and recreate over time. And so that the narrative of the self was very much what I was interested in. Then I kind of like I still have one more actually that I'm working on. It's still in the studio and it's going to be in my hopefully in my next show. But um, then I was started thinking, well, what about that narrative space between the other, right? So there's the narrative space of the internal, right? And the version of yourself that you think you're projecting in the world, which is a fabrication, right? Because nobody experiences the way that you think that you do,
Sure.
that they do. And so I started thinking about what is that narrative between the viewer and another person, right? And so that's when I started doing the female figures. I thought, um, okay, what is that act of looking between the two of them, right?
Mhm.
And so the narrative then became, for me, it was actually in some ways what I was doing is I was flipping over Rodin and riffing on Degas, right? Because Rodin was all about his hand on the surface, and if you look at those sculptures from those figures, those female figures, like I wanted to remove my hand from the surface. I didn't want it to be like there. I wanted it to be about the experience of the presence of another person that has a totally different experience than me. And it makes sense, the female, because I'm not female, right?
Yes.
You know, I'm male, right? And so there's an aspect of like my experience that is a little bit separate, right? So I wanted to create that. The tension was in that narrative between the looker and the looked, and which one is doing the looking, right? Which is why I really wanted to emphasize the sense of agency with those figures, that they're kind of they're in control of the the gaze, right? In a certain sense.
It's a very important word for you. It often comes up when you talk about your work, agency.
Yeah, I think it's a really important one when you're dealing with a subject that you're looking at. And this is kind of what I was saying about Degas, like flipping over Degas, because one of the things about Degas is he was a voyeur. I mean, like
Yes.
I mean, it's very evident, right? I mean, he was, the angles that he took for looking at dancers or whatever is all like he's, I don't know, you get this voyeuristic feel where like some of those, and they're like, I'm not like putting down anything. I'm just like everybody can decide what they like. It always made me uncomfortable. There's like a weird quality that made me uncomfortable. It's kind of like that voyeuristic thing. I never really felt like I'm one of those people who could never like sit and draw strangers. Like I just couldn't do it. I don't know why. I just felt weird, like drawing people that didn't know I was drawing them or weren't active in the process. So I don't know what that is. That's probably more my own neurosis than anything else. But the point is that like I really wanted to create a situation where you could feel the agency of that subject
Mhm.
aiming back at you in some way or at the viewer in some way. So
Is that quality missing in the first series you did? The series of
I
four?
think so. Yeah, because I think it's all about the feeling of like it's all about the internal narrative, right? Because it's a self portrait. It's not about like how, because I don't, it's more about like a self perception of this story that you create in your head, right? And trying to gain well, I guess in a certain sense there's an agency to it because it's trying to gain a control of what that internal narrative is, right? So so for example, like one of the things when I did with those self portraits is they're they're I wanted them to be like clearly me, and so I had to have certain parameters, right? Like the height, like the facial features had to be like there had to be certain characteristics that were me, but
Mhm.
at the same time, it had to be sculptural, right? And so I'm also sort of using my memory of anatomy and form to sort of manipulate to make it more interesting, right?
Mhm.
So so
So
there's that.
give
That's
yourself
the myth.
massive
Yeah,
biceps.
yeah, not I didn't go that far,
Yeah.
but like it's subtle things. It's subtle things, but like fixing little asymmetries, right? Like
Yeah.
that kind of thing, right? Like
Mhm.
like fixing slight like that. So it's sort of like a um I don't like to use the word idealism because I don't think that's what that is. That's not idealizing. I like the word crystallization. It's like a crystallization
Mhm.
of myself. Sorry, he's like my dog. She's
Mhm.
like looking at me, asking for. So
Crystallization.
the
Very, very, very Stendhalian. Maybe
yeah, oh, totally.
Stendhal used that to talk about love.
Man, I can't. This is the first time I have said that. I have mentioned this. I've been talking about this for like 20 years. The idea of the crystallization of love.
Mhm.
For like, I should have maybe more than that. 25 years. You're the first person who I've ever said this to who actually knew what I was referring to before I described it. Should we tell the viewers?
Let's
Probably.
let's let's
Yeah.
let them know.
Yeah. So one of the thoughts that I started kicking around when I first started working with the figure, and because I noticed in my like starting to study art history, I noticed there's that divide we were talking about, the ideal and the real, right? That and whenever I think the language people use for these things is very imprecise and inaccurate, because what people would say is they would say about a person, they say, oh, you idealize them, right? They'd say like if you like if I did a sculpture of you, right, and I did that, kind of fix this like say asymmetries or whatever they might be, not that your face is actually really
I got
straight.
plenty. Don't worry.
Yeah, but people, like most people would say you idealize them. But I made the point with my students many years ago when I was thinking about these things, that's not idealization. You can't idealize an individual. You can only idealize a category, right? You can have an ideal person, like an ideal human, right? Or ideal man, ideal woman. But an ideal me wouldn't be me. It would be, it would be Apollo, right? Like I wouldn't be recognizable as me if you idealize me, I would no longer be recognizable as me.
Mhm.
I would be Apollo or whatever the ideal is, whatever that happens to be, right?
Mhm.
Okay. So I always made this point that, and I was always searching for like, what is the right metaphor? What is the right idea? And I read that book or
Mhm.
that essay or Stendhal on
Yeah.
love.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then it clicked. I was like, that's it. That's the metaphor. That's the proper language. And the story is, and you can correct me if I get some of these details wrong, but it's been a while since I've read the book. But and so hopefully I remembered this right because I've been telling this for years now. And if I've been saying it wrong, now people are gonna be like, hey, wait a second. Anyway, the story the what was Stendhal was taking a trip from Northern Europe to Rome. And while they were on this trip, one of the traveling companions had a lover in Rome, and all he did on the trip was talk about her. He was just like, couldn't wait to see this woman. Is like, and he couldn't like everything. He just talked about how much he loved her, how beautiful, how great she was. Um, and on their way down to Rome, they went to Salzburg, and of course, Salzburg is named Salzburg because of the salt mines
Mhm.
in the area. And so while they were in Salzburg, they went on a tour to one of the salt mines, and the miners showed them this tradition that they had, which was they would at the end of the mining season they would take a tree branch and they would put it in the mine, throw it in the mine, and when they go back and they would get the tree branch, it would be covered with these crystals of salt,
Mhm.
right? Okay. Anyway, Stendhal, like that stuck in his mind, that image. But they got to Rome, and they met the woman this man had been talking about, and
Mhm.
everybody was like, "Well, she's just kind of normal and average." Like they were expecting like this princess, right? They thought they were expecting this, this like this Aphrodite to meet them, and she turned out to be, but to him, the man who was in love with her, she was she was something different, and that's when Stendhal like connected those two experiences of the crystallization of the branch with the salt, and then the man's love for this woman, and he called it the crystallization of love. And so that's why I added a lot of my own little
Mhm.
commentary in there in the story, but I think I got it pretty accurate, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, good.
Yeah.
But uh, that's what I like. That's how I like to think of it when I'm uh, when you when you take a person who's still recognizable, like the tree branch is still recognizable as a tree branch,
Mhm.
but it's covered, it's crystallized. And so
Right.
it has these facets of reflection that allow you to see the branch in a totally different way from
Mhm.
every angle, right?
Mhm.
And that's crystallization. That's why I think it's like when I was thinking about those self-portraits or even the female figures too, I was thinking about that idea of crystallization. Like I wanted it to retain these characteristics of the individual, but
Mhm.
be crystallized,
Mhm.
if that makes sense. Yeah. So
Where do you, so going back to a question we discussed previously, where do you locate the crystallization?
Mm,
And also to build on that, how do you teach this? Like how do you
yeah,
teach crystallization to a sculpting class?
the thing is well, I'll do the second part first. I think it's a difficult thing to teach. In some
Mhm.
ways, I think it's not really teachable because everybody's going to approach it in a different way, right? I mean, um, yeah, everybody's going to approach it in a different way. And I think artists naturally do this, honestly. I think this isn't like there's that old story of like the painters painting the inbred royals and making them look a little bit better. But I also think to flatter them, right? There was a flattery. But I also think that artists naturally kind of do that. That's the poet, again, it's maybe a better word, it's the poetic way of looking at somebody. So
Mhm.
I teach this by discussing it like we're doing now, but I don't think there's a way you can teach the application of it. And even for myself, it's not so much a like a set of procedures that I have for doing it, I kind of know it when I see it, if that makes sense. Like I think there's a like what it is, and again, this goes back to thinking poetically.
Mhm.
It's looking for emergent qualities, right?
Mhm.
That there's something autochthonous within any subject that you're pursuing, right? And it's
Mhm.
coming. You don't have to apply it. It's going to come out of that. You
Mhm.
know, it's going to come out of that ground on its own. And um, like your job is just to look for it. You know, like
Mhm.
your job is to respond and to it and not apply your own ideas. I mean,
Mhm.
that's I think the real art of well, any art form, but the sculpture for me, that's the real art of it is like looking for that quality. I don't think there's not one thing. And in fact, in some ways, honestly, Carla, I hope that I don't have a set of rules because I hope it changes, like the way
Mhm.
I approach this kind of thing. But
Yeah.
let me finish up I have to go backtrack a little bit, but let me finish up because we went off on a tangent there, but we were talking about this sort of narrative quality of my work, and I was talking about starting with the self-portraits, it was about the internal narrative,
Mhm.
right? And then I was talking about the female figures, and it was about the narrative space between the looker and the looked, and which one is doing the looking, right?
Right.
That sort of object stares back, that
Yeah.
book.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a great book. Everybody should read that book. Um, but now where I am with it is now with my work, I'm really changing. I don't really want to do either of those. And I mean, I'll do them maybe now and then, but now I'm actually more interested in an external narrative. Now I like my work. This is why I'm starting to do multiple figures, um, like male nude with a clothed female or whatever it might be, or like I have a commission project that's 11 figures all interacting, and
Mhm.
there is a narrative element to it.
Mhm.
So now I've like reached. I'm kind of in a way. I'm hitting another one of the narrative elements that you can draw upon as an artist, and that's the external narrative that now I'm really interested in that. Like that's now the things. So those like single, I mean, not that I won't ever do the single nudes, male or female, but now I'm more interested in like combining them and maybe and having clothed ones in the narrative. And so that's kind of like the progression. That's going back to the question you asked like 20
Mhm.
minutes ago before I got off on a tangent about Stendhal.
Mhm.
But that's kind of where it's going now. And so in a certain sense, the narrative of agency isn't really necessary anymore because I have the interaction of figures to create
Mhm.
a different kind of narrative, an external narrative that's between those figures. The one thing I would say is that I'm not going to rely upon any received narratives,
Mhm.
at least in any explicit way. I don't see myself doing that. I might riff on them. Like in
Mhm.
other words, I'm not going to do a Pluto and Persephone, right?
The Brokers of Calais. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. I'm not going to do, yeah, exactly. I'm not like I'm sort of create. I think like the more ambiguous narrative qualities. That's more. I think it's more like appropriate for the age we live in,
Mhm.
where like things are like there aren't really common narratives that everybody believes in and sort of can identify. So
Mhm.
anyway, that's kind of where I am. That's the to answer that question about narrative and the
Mhm.
through line and the different kinds of narrative, how it applies to my work. That's kind of how my career, my work has gone. So I'm actually super excited because like these transitional periods, even though they're really in some ways stressful as an artist because you're like, who's going to buy this? Is this going to have any kind of resonance with the viewer? Like,
Mhm.
it's also exciting because you're starting off on a new path. You don't know where it's going to go. I love that. So,
Mhm. Are
yeah,
those behind you, the clay
yeah,
figures behind you, are
yeah.
those like samples for your for a new project?
Yeah,
Are
so
those other
some of
studies?
the these are studies. Some of these individual figures are studies. The gray one there, I can pull it over if you want to see. That's a maquette. And there's another there are maquettes. This is another maquette. These are
Mhm.
maquettes for the figure group I was talking about.
Mhm.
But yeah, I can grab this. This is
Yeah, let's take a look.
yeah, this is I'll just pull like so this is a maquette for this figure group that I'm working on.
Mhm.
Um
Oh, it looks like Jericho. Looks like the Raft of the Medusa.
yeah, you're yeah, I don't want to give away too much with this. I
Yeah.
mean, honestly, I kind of did that quick because um it's not going to be done for like a year and a half and so in bronze. So I don't
Mhm.
want I don't want to give away the whole story just yet.
Sure. Okay.
Um
Yeah. Yeah.
but um but yeah, and then these other ones are studies studies for one of the figures that's in this group that I needed to do from life. But one thing that, like Annie said at the beginning, uh, introducing me, was that I work from life. Actually, the truth is, I probably do like when I'm sculpting, I probably do about 20% from life and 80% from imagination and memory.
Mm.
Um, um, so, uh, so it's a little, it's like, but I do
The
think it's
crystallization is built in.
right, kind of, and also I'm just fast when I work with models. I'm like
Mm.
super fast,
Mhm.
and I can, I yeah, so it's well maybe 20% is wrong, but anyway, you get the point. It's not 100%. I mean, part of the reason that's true that's like that is because when I was starting out and I really needed to, I was trying to figure out how to sculpt. I Models are expensive, man. They're like if you're young and starting out and you don't have, I mean, they're not expensive. I mean, they actually get paid fair. I don't want to make it sound like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
they're not divas. I'm just saying it's like if you're an artist and you're trying to do 30 hours of figure drawing a week and you're paying for it yourself, that's a lot of
That adds
money.
up. Yeah.
Right. So anyway, I just like I really was very intensely focused, and I just know every, like if I had 2 hours, that's all I could afford. I would just like squeeze
Uh-huh.
every bit of it out that I could. And so I have this like very like solid memory of forms that I've seen. And
Mm.
so I can record, I'm pretty good at recording information quickly, but it's also the methodology I use
Mm.
that allows me to get key information in. Um, and I talk about that when I teach my sculpture classes, like where you can actually improve your, like when you run and when you walk kind of thing, right? Like when you, um, like for example, I'll give this is a really simple example.
Yeah.
I always tell students like you should be you should when you should do studies of hands and feet and basic head shapes. um, for example, those three things, just start with that and do lots of them until you can, when you're sculpting from life, like the dumbest thing to do is if you have 2 hours sculpting from life and you start working on the foot, you know.
Mhm.
Like you should have a
Mhm.
foot in your head, you should have a
Yeah.
foot ready to pull out, because nobody's going to look at that sculpture and be like, you know what, everything's right, but that big toe is not his big toe. I know
Yeah.
that model.
Mhm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it's not going to be, and it can be a placeholder for adding a more specific detail of that person's foot later, right? But if you can't, if you like, well, I guess the point is that when you're blocking out a figure in clay, you want to be able to get the basic information really quick with placeholder forms that then
Mhm.
you can add specificity to later, if that makes sense,
Yeah.
right? If so, in other words, if you want to do really hyper real sculpture, it really helps to be able to have a basic shape of a foot that you can do like in a 5 seconds in your mind, and then you can then really kind of scrape away to find the specificity of that model as you observe. But
Mhm.
but anyway, the reason I say all that is because I think it's important to note that that I don't work from models all the time. It's a synthesis of those things, and
Mhm.
yeah, it's a synthesis. I do want when I'm working with a model or working on myself, I do want it to be recognizable as the person.
Mhm.
But I'm not a hyper realist. That's
Yeah.
not what I do. I'm not a hyper realist in that sense. Even though I get categorized that sometimes, that's not how I think my work really reads. But anyway, I mean that's the spectrum as well.
Yeah.
Yep. So
Yeah. Just on the topic of models and classes and all that, you're teaching a workshop for Sicily Artist Retreats in October.
yeah, yeah.
Um, what if any prospective students are in the audience tonight, what can they expect?
Yeah, so we are gonna be working from a model every
Mhm.
day. Um, and we're gonna morning and afternoon, we're gonna work every day from the model. And we're gonna work in water-based clay.
Mhm.
And students will have the opportunity or the option of firing their piece. So it's gonna be terracotta. The figures are gonna be, there's a piece behind me. This that I probably doesn't show the scale, but it's gonna be about that size, the
Mhm.
figure. But we'll probably do like here's this is
80 centimeters.
Yeah, this is it. Yeah, maybe probably a little smaller than that, probably smaller
Well,
than me. But yeah, so this is a terracotta that I
mhm,
did in my studio here. So maybe a little, it'll be bigger than this. That's like probably about that big.
mhm,
But we'll and I don't know what if we have male or female model. To me, it
mhm,
doesn't really matter.
mhm,
But uh, yeah, we'll come up with a pose and same pose throughout the week.
mhm,
Um, and we'll come up with a pose that has some sort of dynamism, some of those qualities that we just talked about,
mhm,
points of tension and weight. And because I talk a lot about composition and how you think of composition as a narrative form, as we mentioned earlier. Um, and we'll talk a lot about tools and different techniques for creating forms. We'll get into a little bit of anatomy, not a crazy amount. So
mhm,
so people shouldn't be scared off if they hear the word anatomy like I don't know anatomy. It's very basic. And one thing I should note as well is that I've been teaching for a long time, over 20 years, and workshops for 15 years.
mhm,
And so I've had all levels of students in the same class, even beginners to professional sculptors. And it's important to mention because sometimes people are on either end of that spectrum can be kind of like, I don't really know. Is this for me? It's like, is it too advanced, or maybe this is not advanced enough? My teaching method is to demonstrate in clay. So I will be sculpting. Everybody will see me sculpting, but I
mhm,
will go around and talk to each individual and make sure that I find something for each of them to latch onto and get. So we'll get the basics, but we also talk about advanced concepts if somebody's professional and they really want to discuss, like, get into the meat of, like, okay, what am I doing like conceptually with this. So I love having the full range of discussions, and I actually really like having them in the same classroom because
mhm,
then you get that. It's an interesting synergy you get when you have you know different levels kind of interacting together. So I would encourage, like, all levels to look into it and consider. But what else? Yeah, we'll be. But like I said, we'll be doing. It'll be water-based clay, and I'll also we talk the one of the biggest focuses of the class and what I teach is observational techniques. So the anatomy is a very minor part. We'll talk a lot about mostly about observational techniques, how to ascertain what you're seeing in 3 dimensions and make it into 3 dimensional forms. It's like I teach very observationally. Okay. In other words, like, to contrast that, I don't teach from like a schemata of, like, we're going to make this classical figure and it has to be this big and it has to be 8 heads tall. Right. I don't use that modality. I'm not,
mhm,
and again, that's totally fine. People do that. But my way of approaching it is to uh, approach it from a naturalistic observational perspective, and then we'll throw in some art history stuff. Like, I love all those discussions, and while we're there in Sicily, we'll go look at some sculptures,
mhm.
especially that dancing satyr. The
Yes.
bronze.
Mhm,
That's a perfect thing to have at our disposal to talk about the history of like representational sculpture, large scale representational sculpture, and where that came from, especially as it relates to bronze casting in ancient Greece, which is
mhm,
really where the revolution of where that switch happened. And because of bronze, and the fact that that's a bronze and they're so rare. They're
mhm.
so rare. Those original Greek bronzes, just they're very, very rare. So that's one of the things we'll do too. Is we'll hopefully get a chance
Right. Um,
talk about that and here today. So there's a lot. I mean,
I,
there's a lot that's going to go on.
I would love to
But
talk about bronze all night because I think
yeah,
it's such a fascinating medium. But the fact I bring here's an interesting point that you're going to be near major archaeological sites
yeah,
in Western Sicily. Um, Generally speaking, Sicily Artist Retreats students aren't from Italy. They're from North America, or they're from Western Europe, or they're from
yeah,
South Asia,
right.
or they're from Australia. What's the advantage of of Italy? What is going to make is this going to be different? Is what
Yeah,
the
yeah.
what experience? What's the difference
Yeah,
between
that's a
staying?
good, that's a really good question. Yeah, it's a great question. There are a couple of things that I think are important for people to consider with courses like this. Uh, First of all, when international class, especially one in Italy or Sicily, which is like a destination in of itself,
Mhm.
you're going to get a more international crowd. Okay. So students, like you mentioned, we're going to be coming from multiple places. Whereas like when I do a workshop in my studio here, which I don't do very often, it's pretty rare. In fact, I don't have any plan for the next 2 years, because I'm so busy and I don't have any space right now. When I do them here, people aren't coming. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the Poconos. Don't get me wrong. Like I like being in Northeastern PA, but people aren't coming here because of the Poconos, right? Like they're coming here just because of the class, right? It's the content of the class and me, hopefully. But but you know, for an international class, especially one like the one in like this in Sicily, is it's there's an aspect of being in that environment that changes the way you look at things. So in other words, like I think you're in a place that has that kind of tradition under like always there under the surface, you can't not see it, right? And it can't not have an effect on the way you experience the subject. It's just a different. They're two different things, you know. They're two different kinds of experience, and they're both good. They're both valid. You know, when I do a class here, it's valid in its own way, but there's no way to replicate that.
Mhm.
I can't replicate Sicily here. It's not
Yeah.
going to happen. I mean, no matter what I did, right? And so there's an aspect of that. You're going to have interaction with people from different backgrounds, right?
Mhm.
More diversity of that kind of experience. So you're building your network of people around the world, which is actually really, really important for people who maybe want to do a class like this. It's really because I think as an artist, you know, I spend an inordinate amount of time in this room by myself.
Mhm.
Like it's almost insane how much time I spend alone. Right? I have my dog. That's fortunately I have a dog. But you know, having those connections with people and building that worldwide network is really energizing and I think important as for developing yourself in either a career just like as an artist and so like I said, I've been doing international workshops now for 15 years and I have friends all over the world. It's like remarkable. I have this network of people that like it's really amazing. And I think that's a really big advantage of doing a class like this because you're going to draw from different places. You're expanding your network of artistic relationships, right? Which is really good. But then back to what I was saying, there's the other big advantage, of course, is that you have the underlying cultural element that's always going to seep in. There's always whenever I do these in Italy, like there's conversations come in that don't come in other places just because you're going to bump into it, you know, and you're going to bump into like what does it mean to be like working in this tradition? You know, what does it mean to be here having this experience and absorbing it, right? So yeah, I think those are like the points that I always make to people who are considering them. And in some ways, I think maybe I'm stating the obvious, right? People probably, but I think it's an important thing to note because I you know they're not. It's not the same. You know, it's not the same as you know just going to some strip mall studio and, and right just like you can't even compare it. You just can't compare it. And I promise anyone like it'll be magical. Like it's
Mhm.
just yeah, it'll be magical. Like I mean, what could be better, really? You know.
Yeah.
So
We promised that too, by the
yeah, yeah.
way.
I just think it's such. I mean, look, I can't. I'm excited. You know, I'm
Mhm.
super excited. I because this is my first time with you folks doing this, and I'm like, I can't wait. Like
Mhm.
I've never been to you know that region,
Mhm.
and so you know, Western Sicily. And so like, and I know that, you know, that especially that Bronze Seder, you know, I'm like,
Mhm.
and you know, this Greek outpost, it's this cross current of ancient culture. And yeah, I can't wait. I think it's going to be fabulous fun. So, So I encourage people to sign up. But yeah, I mean, I think those are the main points for why international workshops. And the thing is that as for the person, for the person teaching the class, I get I get so much out of it in these, like, having these experiences. Um, I get really inspired. Like, I think, part of that is just getting yourself out of your the accepted normal environment. You know what I mean? It's like, just like the displacement helps you see things differently. So
Mhm.
I know that is what will happen with me. I mean, that's like slight displacement from my normal studio is gonna like it's gonna like shake me up a little bit, right? And that's good. So
Right.
yeah, yeah.
Graham.
So
I have a final question, but Annie, I just wanted to check in with you since it's a quarter to nine. Do we have any more
Perfect timing.
audience questions?
Yeah, actually, I just wanted to remind folks, please ask Brian questions while he's here. Like this has been such an incredible conversation. I am totally wrapped. Like this, I'm even more excited for this workshop. So please do not be shy. Drop them in the chat, drop them in the Q&A. Yeah, and let's start to close this out. But Carlo, I'll let you uh, continue, or if you had another question.
Just the last question as we wait for any audience questions. Um, what are you reading right now, Brian?
I am reading Life with Picasso,
Oh,
Francois
by Gilot?
Gillot. Gillot, yeah, yeah,
Incredible. Yeah, I read it last
so
year.
good. Yeah, I've been wanting to read that for years. And so I actually I'm kind of reading I'm reading multiple books right now. Uh, and I've been rereading Jacques Berzon's The Use and Abuse of Art,
Mhm,
which is highly recommend. Like, that's a book that really everyone should read. I also just reread Sarah Lewis's The Rise,
mhm.
because I reread it because she had another book that came out 2024. I just bought it, so I wanted to, like, kind of refamiliarize myself with her, like, train of thinking, and so because I want to start that book next. But the
Mhm.
book that I'm really into is like Francois Gillot's book. So yeah,
Fascinating book.
it's so good. Yeah, it's so good. Yeah,
For so many. I mean, partly because he's such a weird kind
yeah,
of monstrous person. But I was struck by that book by how often he works.
yeah, all
There's
the
a scene where
time.
they're walking on the beach and he has an open nail knife and he just grabs a piece of driftwood and makes a statue
Yep,
while he works.
constantly busy. Yeah, almost mind-boggling. If you ever go to the Musée Picasso in Paris, it's like, geez, how the heck did somebody make all this stuff? It just is beyond
Mhm.
my comprehension. But one of the things I like about the book is that she's when she put that book out, Picasso tried to sue her to
Mhm.
prevent the book from coming out because he was like, she's just going to rip me apart.
Mhm.
But actually, she doesn't really. I mean, she's pretty honest in her assessment of
Yeah.
the fact that she was in love with him. He was a genius, but he was also crazy, and he was also a
Yeah.
bit of a he was also kind of mean spirited and, like, controlling, and, like, but at the same time he could be sweet and gentle. It's like,
Mhm.
it's really, like, it gives you a very, like, full portrait of somebody. It doesn't, like, you know
Mhm.
you think it's going to be, so his fears were really unfounded. He didn't need to worry.
Yes.
It's
Yeah, that's true.
but
I read
yeah.
I read that book immediately after I read a biography of him by Patrick O'Brien, the guy who wrote
Mm-hmm.
Master and Commander, who knew Picasso. And I
Mm-hmm.
was between the two, I was struck. The man was almost nonverbal. The man didn't
Yeah,
speak any, the man didn't have a first language. I mean, he
yeah,
spoke like Andalusian Spanish mixed with Catalan, and then never really mastered French, never learned English.
so true.
And he wanted so desperately to be a poet.
Yeah, it's true. And the thing,
It's so bizarre.
and what's interesting too is, though, he was so pithy at the same time. Like, his insights were really sharp.
Mhm.
Um, I just posted on my Instagram yesterday a quote from that book where he talking about Giacometti, and,
Mhm.
like, it's just like he explained Giacometti in two sentences so
Yeah.
perfectly.
Mhm.
Like, so he could be very pithy, but yeah, you get this sense that, like, he didn't really know the right words to use sometimes, you know,
Mhm.
and the way she describes her conversations with him. But yeah, it's a great book. I highly
If
recommend
you
it.
ever read he did write some poetry, and I think he illustrated it himself. The illustration's so much better than the poetry.
Yeah, yeah.
It's I hate to say this, it's not very good.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's not
Which is
that simple.
amazing for a man who could. I mean, he could just walk into a glassworks and learn
Yep,
about making glass just like that. He could pick it up
yep,
like that.
yep. But he didn't have the facility with words.
Yeah, fascinating.
It's kind of like me dancing, like forget it, not gonna happen. But
Or me
yeah,
counting over 10.
yeah. You know what? Speaking of that, on my Instagram this evening, I'll pick a poem out of this and put it up. I'll
Yeah,
find it. But
fantastic.
anyway, that's what I'm reading right now. It's very entertaining, very insightful, and her writing is like really good. And
Yes.
her first language was like she's like not English at all. I mean, she learned very little English when she was a kid. So her
Well, I think
writing
she
is
wrote it. I
just
think she wrote it with someone from the New York Times,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Colin Collins or something.
She had a
Yeah.
co-author, but still, it's really well written. So
Mhm.
yeah, that's what I'm reading.
Do we have any other any final questions from our viewers tonight?
No, just one asking Brian if you'll be going to Australia anytime soon.
I've been saying I was going to get back to Australia. Every year I keep saying that. I It's not going to be soon. I think it's probably, well, you never know, right? You never know. But this year's pretty full. I mean, I have this big commission project I'm working on that's going to eat up my time, and Sicily in October is the last thing I have planned for a while. I'm going to be doing bronze work after that. I'm going to be so busy until spring of 26. So, like, if you want to get me in a class, you probably should like take the opportunity. It could be a like a year or a half or so. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, maybe I'll just go down there to have fun, and not teach, but just like hang out and sculpt. I have a lot of friends there, so I'm curious to see you ask that question actually. But I would love to get there. I would love to go all over right now, but very, very busy. So unfortunately, probably not going to be for a little while. Yeah,
Come to Sicily then. Okay.
yeah. Come to
We
Sicily. That's
have
the thing. Yeah, that's where
yeah,
it's
we
at.
have another one more in the chat, sorry,
Yep.
from Gail that says I'm just gonna read out loud. I'm relatively new to sculpting, can be slow. And so in workshops like that can be frustrating to not finish before firing.
Yeah.
Um, so that can affect the ability to do facial features, hands,
Yeah.
feet, kind of like what you were talking about. So are you okay, or do you allow room for a more abstracted piece?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
And they're most interested in movement in clay.
Yeah, that's a really great question because one of the things that when I teach sculpture classes, I prioritize the priorities are the proportions are like getting a sense of proportions and trying to create like a believably proportionate figure. But the second is composition, which is all about the pose and gesture and the resonance of those gestures in smaller ways. And then finish is like not in it's like at the bottom of the list. Like if you just like this little one that I held up, if we could see it, you could see it up close. It's very like there's not a lot of detail. It's very like the way I apply the clay, make a mark for something is very rapid and gestural. And so I will talk a lot about that, about how do you find a language in clay with your hands and with your tool, that a language in that material that gives the viewer some interest, even if it doesn't have the detail, because that's the most important thing. If you don't have the compositional and command at all levels, you can make the perfectly detailed eye and it's just not going to work, so yeah, that's a really good question because I always tell students at the beginning, don't worry if you don't have fingernails, that's not important. And in fact, I'll bring my computer and we'll like look at some images of some terracottas and some sculptures, pictures of things that I have to demonstrate that, but I'll also demonstrate it on clay on my own piece, so you can see how I think about gestural things or abstractions, and that can kind of lay the foundation if you do want to get into detail. But if you don't have the right foundation, the details won't help. But if you have the right foundation, you can leave a gestural and it'll look great. Um, we all know that. I mean, we love those like Bernini sketches where he just takes his thumb and it's like, you just see like the clay, there suddenly you have a cheekbone, right? So yeah, that's the fun, right? It's
Right.
playing with that stuff. So
Absolutely
hopefully that answers
awesome.
the question. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, I hope that answered our viewers' question. We have one more.
Okay.
What is the name of the Michelangelo book?
Oh, well, I'll just read it out, but it's the complete poems and selected letters of Michelangelo, translated by Creighton Gilbert, edited by Robert Linscott, and then I'll hold it up, and you can screenshot it.
There
That's
you
even
go.
easier. Yeah, there you go. So, yeah, great book. And I've had this, like I said, I bought this when I was in university, and I've had it all these years. So, yeah,
It's a treasure for sure.
yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Any last minute questions from the audience? Speak now or wait until Sicily.
Well, wait until October.
You
Yeah,
wait until October. Yep. Yep. I
yeah.
won't be answering any questions until October.
No more.
No more questions for the next 6 months.
While we're waiting, actually, I'm just going to, oh, if I can, I was just gonna share a little screenshot of something. I was doing this in Photoshop. I guess I could do it there. Can everyone see my screen? Sorry, it's in
Oh, yeah.
Photoshop. Gets the point across the same way. Um, so if you have any questions about the workshop, just want to clarify some more things, maybe like little details about logistics and what we'll be doing, please send me an email. Again, you can just screenshot here, get rid of the rest of the Photoshop stuff, and send me a note, and I'd love to speak with you. I'll send you a note after this, but just if for easy reference, if y'all want to just screenshot that. And last minute requests for uh for questions. Okay, I don't see any in the chat, so I think we'll be able to wrap it up here. Thank you so much, like both Brian and Carlo. This was incredible. I can't wait for the recording so I can watch it again.
Well,
I'm sure I speak for others as well. This was phenomenal. Thank you so much.
yeah, you're
This was
welcome. Thank
great.
you, Annie. Thank you, Carla. Great
Thank you so
questions,
much,
Carla.
Brian.
Carla, great questions. Like, really
Yeah,
fantastic. You guys, like, that's really, really spot on.
Grand.
Yeah.
awesome. Thank you all so much. Yeah, have a great night. I will be in touch by email. I'll send out the recording to everyone and have a wonderful evening.
Ciao.
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 See you soon.
A presto. Ciao.
That was good. That was really good.